The day my father died, my mother handed me a $20 bill and said it was more than I deserved. I was 32 years old, standing in the funeral home parking lot, watching my siblings drive away in cars that cost more than my annual rent. That $20 bill would turn out to be the biggest lie my family ever told me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the youngest of 4 children in the Morrison family meant learning early that I was different. Not different in any way that mattered to the outside world, but different in the way that families keep their cruelest secrets. While my siblings Rebecca, James, and Michael received private school educations, I attended the local public school. While they got new cars for their 16th birthdays, I got a part-time job at the grocery store to pay for my own transportation. "Sarah needs to learn responsibility," my father would say whenever anyone questioned the disparity. "The others have already proven themselves." What exactly I needed to prove, and how my siblings had already done so by simply existing, was never explained. It was just accepted family doctrine that I was the one who needed to earn everything while they were simply entitled to it. The explanations for why I was treated differently evolved over the years, but the core message remained consistent. I wasn't smart enough, wasn't focused enough, wasn't grateful enough. My mother would shake her head sadly whenever relatives asked about my college plans. "Sarah just isn't college material," she'd say with that particular tone of disappointment that suggested this was a personal failing rather than a financial decision. Some children are meant for other paths. Those other paths, it turned out, involved working 2 jobs to put myself through community college while living in my parents' basement. Not because they couldn't afford to help me, but because helping me would supposedly rob me of character-building opportunities. Meanwhile, Rebecca was completing her master's degree at an expensive private university, funded entirely by our parents. The double standard was so glaring that even family friends began to comment. "Don't worry about what other people think," my father would tell me when I brought up these observations. "They don't understand your situation like we do." My situation, as it was constantly explained to me, was that I was the child who needed to make her own way in the world. The implication was always that this was somehow for my own good, a gift disguised as neglect. When I graduated from community college with honors and transferred to a state university, my parents attended the ceremony but left immediately afterward. There was no celebration dinner, no proud photographs, no acknowledgement of the achievement beyond a brief congratulations. Rebecca's graduation 3 months later was treated like a royal coronation, complete with a catered party and professional photographer. When I asked why the celebrations were so different, my mother looked at me with genuine confusion. "Rebecca's accomplishment is different, sweetheart. She's going to be a lawyer. You're just getting a regular degree." The fact that we were both getting bachelor's degrees and that mine came with significantly higher grades seemed irrelevant to this assessment. What mattered was that Rebecca was destined for greatness, and I was destined for adequacy. The conversations about inheritance began when I was in my mid-20s. Not conversations I initiated, but casual comments my siblings would make during family gatherings. "When Mom and Dad are gone, we'll have to figure out what to do with the house," Rebecca would say, looking directly at me. "It's not like Sarah could afford the upkeep anyway." These comments were always made in front of my parents, who never corrected the assumption that I would be excluded from any inheritance. When I finally worked up the courage to ask directly about my father's will, his response was swift and definitive. "You've already received your inheritance," he said firmly. "Every dollar we spent on your food, clothing, and shelter while you lived here was your share. Your siblings contributed more to this family's success, so they'll receive more when the time comes." The logic was circular and cruel, but it was delivered with the kind of certainty that questioning it seemed unreasonable. My mother's approach was softer, but no less devastating. She would take me aside during family events and speak in the gentle tones reserved for delivering bad news to children. "Your father has worked so hard to build something meaningful for this family," she would say. "Rebecca, James, and Michael understand business, understand investments. They can preserve what he's built. You're different, Sarah. You're more focused on helping people than building wealth. That's admirable, but it's not practical for managing an estate." The subtext was always the same. I was too simple, too naive, too fundamentally different to be trusted with family money. Better to give me nothing than to watch me squander what my father had worked to create. It was presented as a kindness, a way of protecting both me and the family legacy from my inevitable failures. As the years passed, the exclusion became more explicit. Family business discussions happened without me. Financial planning sessions were scheduled when I couldn't attend. Investment decisions were made collectively by my parents and siblings, with my absence treated as natural and expected. I wasn't just being cut out of the inheritance, I was being systematically erased from the family's financial identity. The few times I tried to assert myself, to ask questions about family finances or express concern about being excluded, the responses followed a predictable pattern. My father would become stern and disappointed, explaining that my questions showed a lack of trust in his judgment. My mother would look hurt, suggesting that my concerns were really about greed rather than fairness. My siblings would exchange glances that suggested they'd been expecting this kind of behavior from me. "Sarah's always been jealous of what others have," Rebecca said during one particularly painful family dinner. "She can't just be happy that the family is successful." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I was jealous, but not of their success. I was jealous of their inclusion, their assumed worthiness, their unquestioned place in the family's future. The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. When I pointed out that I'd never been included in financial discussions, my parents would insist that I'd been invited but had chosen not to participate. When I mentioned feeling excluded from inheritance planning, they would suggest that I was being dramatic and that no final decisions had been made. When I brought up the disparity in how my achievements were celebrated versus my siblings, they would accuse me of keeping score and being ungrateful. By the time my father's health began declining, the family narrative about my exclusion was so well established that it felt like natural law. During his final illness, I spent countless hours at the hospital, taking shifts with his care, organizing his medications, coordinating with doctors. My siblings visited occasionally, but the daily burden of caregiving fell largely on me. Even then, the conversations about his estate continued around me, never including me. The night before he died, my father called me to his bedside. For a moment, I thought he might finally acknowledge what had been done, might offer some explanation or apology for years of exclusion. Instead, he took my hand and spoke in the weak voice that had become familiar during his illness. "I want you to know that everything I've done has been for your own good," he said. "Your mother and I love you, but we know you're not equipped for the responsibilities your siblings can handle. Try to understand that this comes from love." Those were among his last coherent words to me. Even facing death, he couldn't acknowledge that the exclusion might have been unfair, couldn't admit that the systematic dismissal of my worth might have been wrong. Instead, he doubled down on the narrative that had defined our relationship for decades. I was loved, but I was lesser. I was family, but I was different. I was deserving of care, but not trust. The funeral arrangements were handled by my siblings. The obituary they wrote mentioned me last, almost as an afterthought. The reception was held at Rebecca's house, and I was expected to help serve food while my siblings received condolences and shared memories with family friends. Even in death, my father's influence maintained the hierarchy that had shaped our family for so long.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Standing in that funeral home parking lot, holding that $20 bill while my siblings discussed their inheritance in voices that carried across the evening air, I felt the weight of 32 years of systematic exclusion. They were talking about properties I'd never known existed, investments I'd never been told about, assets that had been accumulated while I was being told the family lived paycheck to paycheck. The $20 bill felt like the final insult, a symbolic acknowledgement that I was worth something, but barely. As I watched their cars disappear into the distance, I couldn't have imagined that this moment of ultimate rejection was actually the beginning of the most shocking discovery of my life. 3 months after the funeral, I was working my second job at the downtown bookstore when my phone rang. The number had an international prefix I didn't recognize, and normally I would have let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer instead, perhaps the desperate hope that any interruption might break the monotony of grief and financial stress that had become my daily routine. "Miss Sarah Morrison?" The voice had a crisp European accent, formal and businesslike. "This is Klaus Weber from Credit Suisse Private Banking in Zurich. I am calling regarding your father's account with our institution." I almost hung up, assuming it was some kind of scam. My father had never traveled internationally as far as I knew, and the idea of him having a Swiss bank account seemed like something out of a movie. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, already moving to end the call. "My father didn't have any international accounts." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of paper shuffling. "Ms. Morrison, I have documentation here showing you as the primary beneficiary of account number 4471889233067751, established by Robert James Morrison in March of 1987. Is this not your father?" The birth date he read matched exactly. So did the social security number and the address of my childhood home. My hands began to shake as I realized this wasn't a mistake or a scam. This was real, and it was about to change everything I thought I knew about my family. Klaus Weber was patient as I struggled to process the information. He explained that my father had established the account decades ago and had been making regular deposits for over 30 years. The account had been growing steadily through investments managed by the bank's wealth management division. What he told me next made my knees buckle so violently that I had to sit down on the floor behind the bookstore counter. The account contained just over $4.7 million. Mr. Morrison was very specific in his instructions, Klaus continued, apparently unaware that he had just shattered my understanding of reality. "Upon his death, you were to be contacted directly. No other family members were listed as beneficiaries or even as individuals authorized to receive information about the account. He was quite emphatic about maintaining absolute confidentiality during his lifetime." I couldn't speak. The numbers he was quoting were incomprehensible. My father, who had claimed we couldn't afford to help with my college expenses, who had let me work 2 jobs while living in his basement, who had given me $20 as my entire inheritance, had secretly accumulated millions of dollars and left it all to me. "Ms. Morrison, are you still there?" Klaus asked after what must have been a long silence. I managed to confirm that I was, though I felt like I was floating somewhere above my own body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. He continued explaining the process for claiming the inheritance, the documentation I would need to provide, the legal procedures that would need to be followed. As he spoke, my mind raced through decades of memories, reframing every conversation about money, every explanation for why I was treated differently, every justification for my exclusion from family financial discussions. My father hadn't been protecting the family wealth from my incompetence, he had been protecting my inheritance from my family. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and document gathering. Klaus Weber connected me with an American attorney who specialized in international estate law, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handled similar cases involving overseas assets. Patricia's reaction to the situation was immediate and sharp. "This level of secrecy suggests your father was deliberately hiding assets from someone," she said during our first meeting. "The timing of the deposits, the specific beneficiary instructions, the confidentiality requirements. This doesn't look like standard wealth management. This looks like wealth protection." When I explained my family situation, how I'd been systematically excluded from inheritance discussions, her expression grew grim. "Sarah, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did your father ever give you any indication that he had concerns about your siblings or mother regarding money? Any suggestions that they might not handle finances appropriately?" I thought back through years of conversations, looking for clues I might have missed. There had been moments. Comments about Rebecca's spending habits, concerns about James's business decisions, pointed remarks about Michael's gambling problems, but I had always assumed these were minor family complaints, not serious financial concerns. Patricia helped me understand that my father had likely been planning this for decades. The account had been established when I was just 5 years old, suggesting that even then he had concerns about how the family dynamics might affect inheritance decisions. The regular deposits showed a sustained commitment to building something specifically for me, separate from whatever estate planning he had done with the rest of the family. The documentation process revealed even more shocking details. My father had left detailed instructions with the bank, including a sealed letter to be delivered to me along with the account information. When it arrived via secured courier, I recognized his handwriting immediately, though the words were unlike anything he had ever said to me directly. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then it is time for you to learn the truth I was never brave enough to tell you while I lived. Everything I did, every way I treated you, was designed to protect what I was building for you. I knew that if your mother and siblings understood what I was doing, they would find ways to claim it for themselves. It led on to explain that my father had recognized early in my childhood that I was different from my siblings, not in ability, but in character. Where they showed tendencies towards entitlement and financial irresponsibility, I demonstrated integrity and independence. He had watched Rebecca accumulate massive credit card debt that my parents secretly paid off. He had seen James make reckless business investments with family money. He had observed Michael's increasingly serious gambling problems. I made the painful decision to make you financially independent of this family because I knew that including you in traditional estate planning would mean your inheritance would be vulnerable to their poor decisions and manipulative behavior. By making you appear to be the family outcast, the one with no claim to family wealth, I was ensuring that what I built for you would remain yours alone. The cruelest revelation was that my mother had known about the Swiss account from the beginning. She had helped create and maintain the facade of my exclusion, participating in the emotional abuse that had shaped my entire adult life. The systematic gaslighting, the dismissal of my achievements, the constant reinforcement that I was somehow lesser than my siblings. It had all been theater designed to hide the truth that I was actually my father's primary heir. Patricia Chen helped me understand the legal implications of what my father had done. The Swiss account had been funded with money that should have been part of the marital estate, meaning my mother had effectively been defrauded of her community property rights. My siblings had been led to believe they would inherit assets that had actually been transferred overseas decades ago. The entire estate plan that my family was executing was based on incomplete information. Your father created a massive legal mess, but he also created an ironclad case for your ownership of these funds. The Swiss banking laws, the documentation, the decades of deposits, it's all completely legitimate from your perspective. Your family, however, is going to face some very difficult questions about assets they thought were part of the domestic estate. As we prepared to reveal the existence of the Swiss account to my family, Patricia warned me about what to expect. People who have been operating under false assumptions about money rarely react rationally when those assumptions are challenged. Your siblings have been planning their financial futures based on inheritance expectations that were never real. Your mother has been complicit in hiding millions of dollars from the marital estate. This is going to get very ugly very quickly. She was right to warn me. When we requested a meeting with my family and their estate attorney to discuss newly discovered assets, the response was immediate suspicion. Rebecca demanded to know what I thought I had found, suggesting that I was probably misunderstanding some minor account or insurance policy. James accused me of trying to delay the estate's settlement with frivolous claims. Michael simply said I hope I wasn't planning to embarrass myself by challenging a will that had been properly executed. My mother's reaction was the most telling. When Patricia's office called to schedule the meeting requesting that Mrs. Morrison bring any documentation related to her late husband's international business activities, there was a long silence on the phone. When she finally responded, her voice had a quality I had never heard before, fear mixed with resignation.
"How much does she know?" my mother asked, apparently forgetting that Patricia's assistant could hear her clearly. It was the first confirmation that the secrets we were about to expose were secrets my mother had been keeping too. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at Patricia's downtown office. As that day approached, I found myself swinging between fury and heartbreak, between vindication and grief. My father had loved me enough to secure my financial future, but not enough to spare me decades of emotional abuse. He had protected me from my family's greed, but not from their cruelty. He had ensured I would be wealthy, but at the cost of letting me believe I was worthless.
The night before the meeting, I sat in my small apartment holding that $20 bill my mother had given me at the funeral. It seemed like a relic from another life, a symbol of everything I had believed about my place in the world. Tomorrow, I would walk into that conference room as one of the wealthiest people my family had ever known. But tonight, I was still the daughter who had been told she deserved nothing, trying to understand how love and betrayal could be so thoroughly intertwined. The conference room at Patricia Chen's law office felt like a courtroom as my family filed in that Friday morning. Rebecca wore her best suit, the one she saved for important client meetings. James had brought a briefcase as if he expected to be signing important documents. Michael looked hungover and irritated, like he had better places to be. My mother sat closest to the door, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. I took my seat across from them, flanked by Patricia and Klaus Weber, who had flown in from Switzerland specifically for this meeting. The weight of what was about to happen settled over the room like a heavy blanket. For 32 years, these people had controlled the narrative of my worth. In the next hour, that narrative was going to be completely destroyed. Patricia began with the formalities, explaining that we were gathered to discuss assets related to Robert Morrison's estate that had not been included in the probate proceedings. She spoke in the careful, measured tones that lawyers use when they're about to deliver devastating news. My siblings looked bored, probably expecting this to be about some small, forgotten account or a few $1,000s in savings bonds. On March 15th, 1987, Patricia continued, your father established a private banking relationship with Credit Suisse in Zurich, Switzerland. Over the following 35 years, he made regular deposits to this account, building a substantial investment portfolio. Rebecca rolled her eyes and started to interrupt, but Patricia held up a hand. The current value of this account is $4.7 million. The silence that followed was deafening. James's briefcase slipped from his lap and hit the floor with a crash that made everyone jump. Michael's mouth fell open, and for the first time in years, he looked completely sober. Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like panic. My mother never looked up from the table. Klaus Weber took over, his accented English cutting through the stunned silence as he explained the account details. The beneficiary designation that named me exclusively, the confidentiality agreements that had kept the account secret, the specific instructions my father had left regarding the timing of disclosure. With each detail, my siblings' expressions grew more horrified. This is impossible, Rebecca finally managed to say. Dad didn't have that kind of money. We would have known. Her voice had the high, strained quality of someone trying to convince herself as much as others. There has to be some mistake. Sarah isn't even mentioned in the will. Patricia slid a copy of the original account documents across the table. My father's signature was clearly visible on every page, along with my name listed as the sole beneficiary. The dates showed that deposits had been made regularly for decades, including several large transfers that coincided with years when my family had claimed financial hardship. Where did this money come from? James demanded, his face flushed with anger. If Dad had millions of dollars, why were we told the business was struggling? Why did we have to take out loans for college? His voice was getting louder with each question, and I could see the moment when he realized what this meant for his own financial future. Klaus Weber consulted his files and began reading dates and amounts. March 1995, $200,000. September 1998, $350,000. June 2003, $400,000. Each date corresponded to a time when my family had made a big financial decision. Rebecca's law school tuition, James's first business loan, Michael's rehab that my parents had supposedly emptied their savings to pay for. Those were supposed to be sacrifices, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. You told us you were sacrificing for our futures. He was looking at my mother, who still hadn't raised her eyes from the table. You said there wouldn't be anything left after helping all of us get started. That's when my mother finally spoke, her voice so quiet we had to lean forward to hear her. He never told me how much. I knew about the account, but I never knew how much. She looked up then, not at my siblings, but at me. Her eyes were filled with tears, but also with something that looked like relief. He said it was for your future, Sarah. He said the others would spend it all if they knew about it.
The room erupted. Rebecca started shouting about fraud and hidden assets. James accused my mother of conspiring to steal his inheritance. Michael just kept repeating $4.7 million like he couldn't make the numbers make sense. Through it all, I sat quietly, watching my family destroy itself over money they had never actually been entitled to. Patricia let them vent for several minutes before calling for order. When she had their attention again, she delivered the next blow. There's more you need to understand. Mrs. Morrison, by participating in hiding these assets, you may have committed fraud against the marital estate. The money your husband deposited in Switzerland was community property that should have been disclosed during your marriage. My mother's face went pale. I never touched the money. I never even knew the account numbers. But Patricia shook her head, explaining that knowledge of hidden assets, even without direct access, could still constitute legal complicity. The estate plan my family had been executing was based on incomplete financial information, which meant the will itself might be invalid. Klaus Weber added the final devastating detail. My father had left specific instructions that if any family member contested my inheritance or attempted to claim any portion of the Swiss account, additional documentation would be released. He had been preparing for this possibility for years, gathering evidence of my siblings' financial irresponsibility and my mother's complicity in the deception. What kind of documentation? Rebecca asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Klaus opened another file and began reading. Credit reports showing Rebecca's hidden debts.
Bank records of the gambling debts my parents had secretly paid off for Michael. Documentation of James's failed business ventures that had been funded with family money. Even records of my mother's expensive shopping habits that had been hidden from the family budget. Your father was very thorough, Klaus said simply. He documented every financial decision that confirmed his belief that Sarah was the only family member who could be trusted with significant wealth. The evidence painted a picture of a family living beyond their means while telling me we couldn't afford basic necessities. It showed my siblings burning through money as fast as it was given to them, while I worked multiple jobs to support myself. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and brutal. Rebecca hired her own attorney, demanding that the Swiss account be included in the probate estate and divided equally among all children. Her lawyer's initial confidence crumbled when faced with 35 years of documented evidence showing my father's deliberate intent to exclude his other children from this specific inheritance. James attempted to claim that my father had been mentally incompetent when he established the account, but the medical records Patricia subpoenaed showed no evidence of cognitive decline. In fact, the regular correspondence between my father and the Swiss bank demonstrated increasing sophistication in his investment strategies over the years. Michael's approach was more personal. He showed up at my apartment one night, crying and begging me to share the inheritance. "We're family," he kept saying. "Dad was sick to do this to us. You know this isn't fair." But fairness, I realized, was a concept my family had never applied to me. They had felt no obligation to be fair when they excluded me from family discussions, dismissed my achievements, or made me feel worthless for 32 years. The most painful confrontation came with my mother. She called me repeatedly, alternating between apologies and accusations. "I did what your father asked me to do," she would say. "I thought it was best for everyone." But when I asked her why she had participated in making me feel unloved and unwanted, why she had allowed the emotional abuse to continue year after year, she had no answer. "You were never supposed to be hurt by it," she finally said during our last conversation. "It was just supposed to be temporary, just until you were old enough to inherit." But 32 years of temporary had shaped my entire sense of self-worth. The damage done by decades of systematic exclusion couldn't be undone by a bank account, no matter how large. The final legal resolution took 8 months. My inheritance was confirmed as legitimate and beyond challenge. My siblings' attempts to claim portions of the Swiss account were dismissed by the courts. My mother faced financial consequences for her role in hiding marital assets, though she avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with the investigation. Today, I live in a house I bought with cash, in a city far from my family. The money has given me freedom I never imagined possible, but it has also given me something more valuable: the truth about who I really was in my family's eyes. My father had seen my worth even when he couldn't show it.
He had recognized my integrity even while he was forced to hide his recognition. I still have that $20 bill my mother gave me at the funeral. I keep it in a frame on my desk, not as a symbol of what I was denied, but as a reminder of how completely wrong people can be about your value. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who understand you the least. My siblings and I no longer speak. Rebecca lost her law practice when clients learned about her hidden debts. James's business failed when he could no longer rely on family money to cover his poor decisions. Michael finally got the help he needed for his gambling addiction, though it came too late to save his relationship with his children. My mother sends cards on my birthday and Christmas, carefully worded messages that never quite apologize for the past, but hint at regret for choices made. I read them and file them away, understanding now that some relationships are too damaged by deception to ever fully heal. The Swiss bank account changed everything about my life, but the most important change wasn't financial. It was learning that sometimes the person who believes in you most is the one who seems to believe in you least. Sometimes protection looks like abandonment, and sometimes love hides behind what feels like indifference. $4.7 million was my inheritance, but the real treasure was discovering that I had never been worthless after all. I had just been worth too much to risk losing. 5 years have passed since that phone call from Switzerland changed everything I thought I knew about my life. I'm sitting in the garden of my own home now, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The house is modest by wealthy standards, but it's mine in a way that nothing ever was when I lived under my family's roof. Every decision about this place was made by me, for me, without having to justify or explain or apologize for wanting something beautiful. The money transformed my circumstances, but the real transformation came from understanding my father's impossible choice. He had loved me enough to sacrifice our relationship to protect my future. Every harsh word, every dismissal, every moment when he had to watch me hurt while he played his part in the deception must have been agony for him. The letter he left revealed a man torn between protecting his daughter and appearing to abandon her. I've used the inheritance wisely, exactly as he hoped I would. Part of it funds a scholarship program for students from dysfunctional families who show academic promise despite their circumstances. Another portion supports a nonprofit that helps people navigate complex family legal situations. The rest provides me with the security to choose work that matters to me rather than work that simply pays the bills. Klaus Weber still calls occasionally to discuss investment strategies, but our conversations have evolved beyond mere financial planning. He has become something of a friend, someone who witnessed the moment my life completely changed and understands the complexity of my feelings about that transformation. He tells me my father would be proud of how I've handled both the money and the truth about our family. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my father had found the courage to tell me the truth while he was alive. Would I have understood his reasoning? Would I have been able to forgive the years of emotional isolation? Would our relationship have survived the revelation that everything I believed about my place in the family was a carefully constructed lie? I'll never know, but I've made peace with the questions that can't be answered. The most unexpected consequence of inheriting that Swiss bank account was discovering my own strength. For 32 years, I had defined myself through my family's assessment of my worth. I was the disappointing daughter, the one who couldn't measure up, the one who deserved less. Learning that assessment was deliberately false forced me to rebuild my entire sense of identity from the ground up. I am enough. I always was enough. The family that raised me was simply incapable of recognizing or acknowledging that fact because doing so would have compromised their elaborate deception. My worth was never actually in question. It was just hidden behind a performance designed to protect what my father was building for me. The $20 bill still sits framed on my desk, but its meaning has evolved. It's no longer a symbol of rejection, but a reminder of how drastically wrong our perceptions can be. It represents the moment when I believed I had received everything I was worth, not knowing I was actually heir to millions. It reminds me that sometimes the people who seem to value us least are actually the ones working hardest to secure our futures. My family story didn't have a Hollywood ending, where everyone forgives each other and gathers around the Christmas table. Some betrayals cut too deep for complete healing. Some deceptions are too fundamental to forgive entirely. But understanding the motivation behind the deception has brought me a kind of peace I never expected to find. I am wealthy now, not just financially, but in ways that matter more than money. I have clarity about who I am and what I'm capable of achieving. I have freedom from the toxic dynamics that shaped my early life. Most importantly, I have proof that I was loved, even when that love was expressed in ways too complicated for me to recognize at the time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.